The crisp air of Christmas Eve hung over the small town of Larkspur, Colorado, as gently as the snowflakes that drifted from the starlit sky. Each house along Maple Street was adorned with glowing lights, twinkling in patterns that pulsed like the heartbeat of the season. The town had always worn its festive cheer like a badge of honor, with red and green wreaths, pine garlands, and the distinct, mouth-watering aroma of baked goods wafting from kitchen windows. But for little Sam Rivers, an 8-year-old boy with curly brown hair and wide, hopeful eyes, this Christmas would be different. In the cozy Rivers household, the lights on the tree shone with a warm, yellow glow. Tucked beneath its low, sweeping branches, a pile of carefully wrapped presents waited, their glossy paper reflecting the soft flicker of the fireplace. Sam's excitement was palpable, his hands pressed eagerly to the frosted window pane as he peered out into the night. He had spent the past 3 months asking for only one thing, his voice vibrating with a mix of urgency and certainty whenever he spoke about it. A puppy. Not just any puppy, but a friend. A confidant to share his childhood adventures with, and someone to keep the loneliness at bay since his father's passing 2 years prior. "Sam, come on. It's almost bedtime," his mother, Laura, called softly from behind him. Her eyes, still shadowed by the weight of grief, glistened with the effort to maintain a smile. She wore her long blonde hair pulled into a loose ponytail, and though she looked tired, the light in her gaze was warm. Laura worked double shifts at the local diner and often hummed softly to herself while baking Christmas cookies, an attempt to fill the house with the joy that had once come so easily. "But what if Santa doesn't know?" Sam whispered, turning to face her. His voice wavered just enough to twist something deep in Laura's chest. He had whispered that question every night for weeks, as if Santa needed a reminder of his most important wish. Laura knelt down, wrapping him in a hug that smelled of gingerbread and pine. "He knows, sweetheart. Santa always knows." Hours later, after Sam had been tucked into bed and the house had grown still, Laura carried out the final touches of their Christmas surprise. A rustling sound came from the laundry room, accompanied by a muffled bark. There, in a small woven basket lined with an old flannel shirt, was a Labrador Retriever puppy. She was golden, with eyes that mirrored the color of warm caramel and a small, pink nose that twitched each time she yawned. Laura stroked the soft fur between the puppy's ears, feeling a surge of hope that tomorrow morning would bring a rare moment of unadulterated joy. "Let's make this a Christmas to remember," she whispered before carrying the basket to the living room and setting it under the tree. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with a gust that seemed to hold a warning. Snow fell in thick flakes, casting an almost magical glow over the yard. Across the street, lights blinked on and off in rapid succession, while faint laughter echoed through the air as neighbors gathered for last-minute caroling. The town, blanketed in snow and the warmth of community, seemed untouchable by anything but the spirit of the season. The clock struck midnight. Laura's eyes closed for a moment too long, exhaustion overtaking her as she curled up on the couch. She hadn't noticed the slight wiggle beneath the tree, the tiny paw pushing against the ribbon tied loosely around the basket's edge. Nor did she catch the small whimper that followed as the puppy, curious and eager, found a path to freedom. The living room glistened with Christmas magic. The twinkling lights, the snowflakes falling just outside the window, and the gentle crackling of the fireplace. But the magic was short-lived. With a soft hop and a thud, the puppy made her way down from the basket, sniffing the air with newfound wonder. She padded across the floor, claws clicking softly against the polished wood, her small tail wagging in rhythm with her tiny, uncertain steps. Outside, the gusting wind swept up again, making the door rattle. It had been left unlatched after Laura's last-minute run to the shed earlier that night, and now it stood slightly ajar. The puppy's ears perked up. She tilted her head to one side as if listening to a call only she could hear. Drawn by the swirling snow and the wild scent of pine, she pushed her way through the crack and slipped into the night, leaving behind a house still bathed in the glow of Christmas lights. Minutes passed before a low whine startled Laura awake. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the soft glow of the Christmas tree and the empty basket beneath it. The realization struck her like a shockwave, pushing her upright in an instant. The puppy was gone. Outside, the night was fierce, with snow blanketing the earth and swallowing the puppy's tiny paw prints almost as quickly as she could make them. As Laura rushed to the open door, panic tightened her chest, and the cold bit at her skin. The puppy, lost in the deepening snowstorm, was out there, alone. The wind howled through the town of Larkspur, its mournful wail slicing through the air like a warning. Laura stood at the threshold, staring out into the darkness that swallowed the snow-covered streets. The biting cold seeped into her bones, but the real chill was the panic growing in her chest. The puppy was out there somewhere, alone and defenseless. She had to find her before the storm did. "Sam!" Laura called, her voice strained, caught between worry and resolve. She hesitated, glancing toward the hallway where her son lay asleep, unaware of the sudden chaos. She couldn't risk waking him to this, not yet. The weight of his hope, the wish he'd whispered into every snowflake since Thanksgiving, rested on her shoulders. The thought of his eyes, wide with joy turned to despair, propelled her into action. Pulling on her heavy coat and boots, Laura grabbed a flashlight from the entryway. The beam cut through the dark, scattering shadows across the freshly fallen snow. Each step outside was met with the crunch of ice and the sting of wind that whipped her hair into a frenzy. She called out again, louder this time, the name they'd chosen echoing off silent houses. "Lassie, come here, girl." Meanwhile, Lassie, the golden Labrador, ventured further into the heart of the storm, her small paws sinking deeper with every step. Snow clung to her fur, turning her a dappled white and gold. The sense of pine and frost mingled in the air, carrying hints of adventure and danger she couldn't comprehend. But the cold was numbing, and for the first time in her short life, Lassie felt something like fear. Her tiny whimpers were swallowed by the roaring wind. Back at the house, Sam stirred. A prickle of unease passed over him, bringing him fully awake. He squinted into the dim room, where Christmas lights cast long, colorful shadows. Something was off. He sat up, clutching the quilt to his chin as he listened. Faintly, he heard the sound of his mother's voice, carried by the wind, calling a name he knew by heart. Lassie, his Lassie. Barefoot, Sam scrambled out of bed and ran to the window. His breath fogged up the glass as he pressed his face against it, searching the yard. The door stood wide open, and fear bloomed inside him like a cold, hollow flower. Without thinking, he threw on his coat and boots, barely managing to zip up before he stumbled into the icy night. Laura's heart ached with every unanswered call. She pushed deeper into the swirling snow, the beam of her flashlight flickering as it caught movement in the distance. Was that? No, just a trick of the light. The trees groaned under the weight of frost, their branches creaking like old bones. The silence of the street was broken only by the sound of her own hurried breaths and the relentless wind. "Lassie!" Her voice cracked with urgency. And then, faintly, she heard it. A bark, high-pitched and trembling, came from the direction of the town square. Laura's pulse quickened as she pivoted, the light sweeping across the open space lined with holiday decorations. Each step was a battle against the drifts of snow building around her legs. Lassie, exhausted and nearly frozen, had found shelter beneath a park bench, its metal frame encrusted with ice. Her small body shook, and her eyes were half closed, lids heavy with frost. But the sound of Laura's voice was a lifeline, pulling her from the edge of sleep. She barked again, though weaker this time, her breath forming small clouds that dissipated in an instant. Sam appeared on the porch, his small frame outlined by the glow of Christmas lights. The sight of the open door sent a spike of dread through him, but he spotted movement, a flash of his mother's figure disappearing into the snowy haze. And he ran, driven by the same urgency that had propelled Laura moments before. "Mom! Mom!" Sam's voice was barely more than a squeak against the howling wind. The wind roared like an untamed beast, snatching Sam's voice and flinging it into the storm. He pushed forward, legs trembling beneath the weight of the thick snow. The icy air stung his cheeks, turning them raw and red, but nothing could stop him. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as he stumbled into the street, squinting through the storm for any sign of life. "Lassie," he called, his voice breaking. Tears pricked at his eyes, not from the cold, but from the fear that coiled tight in his chest. Somewhere in this storm was the friend he hadn't even gotten to know yet, the one he'd wished for every night, pressing his hands together until they ached, hoping for a miracle. Laura, farther ahead in the square, heard the faint, panicked cry. She spun around, eyes widening when she spotted the small, shivering silhouette of Sam. Horror mixed with relief. He was out here too, his face pale and scared, lips already turning blue from the cold. "Sam!" she screamed, the sound torn away by the wind almost as soon as it left her mouth. She stumbled back towards him, her body fighting the storm with every ounce of strength she had left. The town square, normally a place of peace and joy, felt like a battlefield. Snow flurries whirled and danced, obscuring her view. She could just make out the shape of the fountain in the center, and beyond that, something moving beneath one of the benches. The puppy, Lassie whimpered, ears flattening against her head as she recognized Sam's voice. Even in the cold, her tail thumped once, twice, against the metal of the bench leg. But she was weak, the frost clinging to her fur like shards of glass, and it was becoming harder to keep her eyes open. She let out a small, pitiful yelp, the sound a desperate plea that pierced through the cacophony of the storm. Sam's ears perked up at the sound. He knew it as surely as he knew his own heartbeat. "Lassie!" He pushed on, legs wobbling, the snow swallowing him up to his knees. The park loomed closer, the lights of Christmas decorations blurring in his vision like a mirage. Laura reached Sam just as he broke into a clumsy run toward the bench. She grabbed him, pulling him into her arms and holding him close, feeling the frantic drumbeat of his tiny heart. "You shouldn't be out here," she cried, tears freezing on her lashes. "But Lassie, Mom, she's here. I heard her." Sam struggled against her hold, his eyes wide with determination and fear. Laura's gaze followed his, locking onto the faint movement under the bench. Hope surged, quick and sharp, and she released him just enough to let them both rush forward. They reached the bench together, Laura falling to her knees in the snow as Sam dropped beside her. Lassie was curled up, eyes half shut, her little body shivering uncontrollably. Sam reached out a trembling hand, the tips of his fingers brushing the cold fur. "It's okay, girl. We found you," he whispered, his voice cracking as a tear rolled down his cheek. The puppy's eyes opened just a sliver, the caramel color dull but warm, like the faintest glow of a dying ember. Laura moved quickly, wrapping her scarf around Lassie and lifting the tiny body into her arms. The warmth of her own body seeped through, and she felt the weak pulse of life that flickered within the puppy. "We need to get home now," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. Together, mother and son hurried back through the storm, Sam's small hand clutching Laura's coat tightly. The streets of Larkspur were eerily quiet. The storm muffled any sounds beyond the whistling wind. Lights in the windows of houses were dimmed, the last remnants of Christmas cheer flickering behind curtains as families slept, oblivious to the drama unfolding outside. As they reached the front porch, Sam's strength gave out, and he stumbled. Laura's arm shot out, pulling him close as she kicked open the door and ushered them inside. Warmth washed over them like a tidal wave, the sudden contrast leaving them dizzy. She dropped to her knees in front of the fireplace, setting Lassie down on the rug where the heat could reach her. Sam knelt beside the puppy, eyes wide with worry. "Is she going to be okay?" His voice was barely a whisper, shaking as hard as his small body. Laura's hands worked quickly, drying the puppy with a towel and rubbing gently to stimulate circulation. Lassie's small chest rose and fell, the rhythm shallow but steadying. "We need to keep her warm. She'll be okay, Sam." "She has to be," Laura said, though her voice carried the weight of uncertainty. The minutes ticked by, each second dragging with it a silence so profound that even the crackling fire seemed muted. Sam sat cross-legged beside Lassie, his fingers stroking her fur, eyes never leaving her face. He whispered words of encouragement, fragments of Christmas songs, anything to fill the space with hope. Finally, a tiny shudder passed through Lassie's body. Her tail moved, just a flick, and her eyes opened fully, searching the room before settling on Sam. A small, weak bark escaped her, and Sam let out a gasp, his face lighting up with relief and joy. "She's going to be okay, Mom. She's going to be okay." His voice rose, breaking into a laugh mixed with tears. Laura felt the tension that had wrapped around her heart finally release. She wrapped her arms around Sam, pulling him close as they both watched Lassie shift and wag her tail again, stronger this time. The puppy licked Sam's hand, the warmth of her small tongue a promise that she was there, she was safe. The warmth of the fire spread through the room, bathing everything in a soft, golden glow. The once harsh, howling wind outside now seemed like a distant murmur, sealed away by the thick walls of the river's home. Lassie lay curled up on the rug, her eyes half open, lids fluttering with exhaustion. But each breath came a little easier now, a little deeper, as the warmth seeped back into her tiny body. Sam sat beside her, unwilling to move even an inch. His small fingers traced circles in the soft fur on Lassie's back, as if the gentle touch alone could tether her to him, anchoring her here where she belonged. He kept whispering reassurances, eyes still shimmering with tears that had yet to dry. "You're safe now, Lassie. You're home." Laura watched them from her spot by the fireplace, her heart full and aching with relief. The past hour had been a storm of emotions. Fear, desperation, hope, and now, seeing the fragile life of the puppy flicker back to strength filled her with a gratitude she couldn't put into words. The room around her, decorated with homemade ornaments and lined with wrapped presents, looked different somehow, more sacred, as though it were not just a place to celebrate Christmas, but a sanctuary where miracles could happen. Laura reached out and pulled Sam into a hug, the kind that only a mother could give, deep and encompassing, a fortress of comfort. He leaned into her, his small body finally allowing itself to relax, tension melting away like the snow on Lassie's fur. "Mom, I was so scared," he said, his voice muffled against her sweater. "I know, sweetheart. I was too," Laura whispered, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. "But Lassie's here now, and so are you. And that's all that matters." The puppy shifted, lifting her head to look at Sam with eyes that glistened like melted caramel. She let out a tiny, hoarse bark and nudged his arm with her cold, damp nose. It was enough to make Sam giggle, the sound breaking through the solemn silence and filling the room with the echo of joy that had been missing for too long. "Mom, look, she's better," Sam exclaimed, eyes wide and bright. He clapped his hands gently, and Lassie's tail gave a few tentative wags, a response that made his laughter bubble up again. Laura's eyes misted over, a mix of relief and a deep, aching love that made her throat tighten. Suddenly, the quiet moment was punctuated by a sharp knock at the door. Laura's heart leapt into her throat. Who could be out in this storm? She exchanged a worried glance with Sam before getting to her feet and crossing to the door. She opened it cautiously, a gust of cold air sweeping in as she came face to face with her neighbor, Mr. Henson. The elderly man was wrapped in a thick, woolen coat, his white beard frosted with snow. "Sorry to bother you so late, Laura," he said, his voice raspy but warm. "I saw your light still on and wanted to make sure everything was all right. I thought I heard shouting earlier." Laura's eyes softened, and a small smile tugged at her lips. "Thank you, Mr. Henson. We had a bit of a scare, but everything's fine now." His gaze shifted to Sam and Lassie, who was now trying to stand on wobbly legs. Mr. Henson's eyes crinkled at the edges as he smiled. "Looks like Santa brought just what you needed," he said with a wink. Sam nodded eagerly, his cheeks flushed with excitement. "Yeah, and we almost lost her, but Mom and I found her in the snow. It's a Christmas miracle." He looked at Lassie, who gave another bark, louder this time, as if in agreement. Mr. Henson chuckled, a sound deep and full, as he took a step back into the snowy night. "Well, I'm glad to hear it. Merry Christmas to you all," he said, tipping his hat before turning and heading back to his own house, the snow crunching under his boots. Laura closed the door, leaning against it for a moment as she let the warmth of the room envelop her again. Sam had returned to Lassie's side, talking to her in a voice full of affection and excitement. The puppy responded with a lick to his cheek, and he laughed again, the sound pure and carefree. The night wore on, and the storm outside finally began to wane. The wind settled, and the snow fell gently, dusting the rooftops and trees in a soft, glistening blanket. Inside, the fire crackled, casting a glow over the room that made the lights on the tree sparkle even brighter. Lassie, now fully awake and more alert, nuzzled into Sam's side, her tail wagging steadily. The fear of the night's adventure seemed to melt away in the warmth of their newfound bond. Laura watched them with a soft smile, feeling the weight of the past few years, marked by grief and longing, begin to lift. In its place, there was something new and fragile. Hope. Sam looked up at her, eyes bright. "Mom, this is the best Christmas ever," he said with the earnestness that only a child could muster. Laura knelt down beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. She looked at Lassie, who rested her head on Sam's knee, and nodded. "Yes, Sam, it really is." The night grew quiet, with only the soft pop and hiss of the dying fire breaking the silence. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the town of Larkspur wrapped in a peaceful stillness. The snow gleamed under the moonlight, untouched and sparkling like diamonds. Inside the river's home, Sam had finally drifted off, his small body curled up next to Lassie, who had nestled against him as though she'd never leave his side again. Laura sat back on the couch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the two with eyes full of love. She hadn't felt this light in years, as if a burden had been lifted with the arrival of this tiny, golden pup. She closed her eyes, the warmth of the moment seeping into her soul. The past few years had been heavy, marked by an emptiness she hadn't known how to fill. But tonight, she realized that love had found its way back into their lives, not with the fanfare of a wrapped gift or a holiday feast, but through the brave, unwavering heart of a little boy and the loyalty of a puppy who had risked the cold, stormy night to be found. The fireplace crackled one last time before the flames settled into embers, glowing softly like the promise of a brighter tomorrow. Laura reached over, brushing a stray curl from Sam's forehead and whispering, "Merry Christmas, my love." A sleepy murmur was his only response as he curled tighter against Lassie, who blinked up at Laura with eyes that seemed to say, "Thank you." Tears pricked Laura's eyes, not out of sorrow, but out of a gratitude so profound that it swelled inside her, filling the cracks left by loss. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living together. As she glanced at the twinkling lights on the tree, she thought about all the wishes whispered into the dark, and how sometimes miracles come quietly, wrapped not in paper and bows, but in fur and wagging tails. In that moment, Laura understood something important. Christmas wasn't just about the gifts or the carols or even the tree. It was about love, resilience, and the way they all held on to each other, even through the fiercest of storms. And with that, the river's home settled into the peaceful silence of a Christmas morning, where hope and joy had finally come home to stay.